Introduction. The power of understanding people without words. In a world that moves at a dizzying speed, where words are often unnecessary and gestures say everything, the ability to understand people without them saying a single word has become a silent but powerful advantage. It's not simply about reading expressions or interpreting gestures. It's about developing a deep capacity for conscious observation, of capturing what happens behind the verbal curtain, of discovering the true emotions, intentions, and thoughts hidden in the smallest details. This skill, when mastered, completely transforms the way we relate, make decisions, and navigate personal, professional, and social environments. Because when you can understand someone from the first moment, you no longer react. You choose how to respond. You no longer allow yourself to be manipulated. You know what's happening. You no longer live on the surface of human interactions. You access the true depths. Many people believe that speaking well is the secret to connecting, leading, or persuading. And while verbal communication has its value, true influence comes not from words, but from understanding. You can speak powerfully, use impeccable language, and have stage presence, but if you don't know how to read what the other person is really feeling or thinking, you'll always be sailing in the dark. Because every human being communicates without speaking. They do so with the way they sit, with their eyes, with their hands, with their pauses, even with their silences. And if you are able to train your perception, if you learn to fine-tune your sensitivity and set aside your prejudices and distractions, you will begin to clearly see what others barely intuit. You don't need superpowers or an academic training in psychology. What you need is intention, practice, awareness, and knowledge. And that is exactly what this training will lead you to master the art of reading people accurately, ethically, and transformatively. Imagine walking into a meeting and instantly sensing who's uncomfortable, who's feigning confidence, who's trying to assert their power, who's truly connected to you. Imagine having a difficult conversation with someone close and being able to see, beyond their defensive words, the fear or insecurity driving them. Imagine being able to avoid damaging relationships from the start because you pick up on signals others miss. Or improving your relationships because you finally understand what the other person can't express. This isn't a fantasy. It's a skill you can develop. And once you have it, you won't want to let go. Because you'll feel freer, more prepared, and, above all, more aware. But to achieve this, you need more than curiosity. You need method. And that's what you'll find here. Over the next few hours, you'll follow a structured path that will take you from the fundamentals of human perception to advanced techniques used by interrogators, negotiators, and behavioral analysts. You'll learn how our mind works when observing others, how we interpret signals, and how those signals are altered depending on context and culture. You'll discover body language as a silent code that, if you know how to decipher, will open up a whole new world to you. You'll train your mind to become emotionally neutral, to observe without judging, to notice without hastily interpreting. You'll learn to detect lies without confrontation, and to listen beyond words with strategic sensitivity. The most important thing is that this knowledge isn't empty theory. Everything you'll hear has been tested, studied, and applied in real-life situations. It's based on scientific evidence, behavioral psychology, social neuroscience, and the accumulated experience of people-reading experts. But it's also adapted to everyday life, because most of your interactions don't happen in an interrogation room, but in a conversation with your partner, a job interview, a business negotiation, a family argument, or even a chance encounter with someone who can make a difference in your life. That's why every concept, every strategy, and every technique is explained in a simple, direct, and practical way so you can apply it starting today. So you don't just understand it, but also integrate it. And it's not just about reading others. As you develop this skill, you'll realize something deeper. You'll begin to understand yourself better. Because by observing others closely, you'll also begin to notice your own patterns, your reactions, your projections. The way you interpret the world reveals you, and this journey will not only be outward, but also inward. You'll be confronted with your automatic judgments, your cultural biases, your personal history that filters what you perceive. And that's where true transformation happens. When you begin to cleanse your gaze, you not only see others more clearly, you also see yourself more honestly. And that is the beginning of a deeper, more mature, freer consciousness. This audiobook isn't a collection of manipulation tricks or a magic recipe for mind reading. It's an honest, in-depth, and ethical guide to help you become a more aware, more empathetic, and more accurate person. Because understanding isn't dominating, it's connecting. And when you truly connect, when you understand what the other person is experiencing in their inner world, it opens the door to more authentic relationships, smarter decisions, and a life more aligned with truth. Whether you're looking to gain more control in your interactions, protect yourself from manipulative people, influence ethically, or simply improve your human connection, this journey will provide you with valuable tools. But like any powerful tool, its impact will depend on your responsibility in using it. Because reading others is a form of power. And power must always go hand in hand with awareness. So open your mind, leave behind what you think you know, and prepare to train one of the most valuable skills any human being can develop: the ability to see beyond words. The world is full of signs waiting to be read. And after this journey, you'll be ready to interpret them with precision, wisdom, and purpose. Your training begins here. But before continuing, please write in the comments which city you're listening to this audiobook from, and if this message resonates with you, subscribe to the channel now. This way, you'll be sure not to miss any content that nourishes your mind and brings you closer every day to the life you truly deserve. There's no time to waste. Now, let's continue. Chapter 1. The Science of Human Perception. How our mind works when observing. From the moment we see someone for the first time, our mind begins a complex and silent process: perceiving, evaluating, categorizing. In a matter of seconds, even without the other person saying a single word, we have already formed an impression. It may seem like magic, intuition, or a simple hunch, but in reality, behind that immediate sensation lies a deep network of automatic mental processes that lead us to decide whether someone is trustworthy, dominant, insecure, genuine, or fake. This process is called social perception, and it is one of the oldest mechanisms our brain has developed to ensure our survival in a social environment full of nuances, threats, and opportunities. However, although it occurs automatically, it is not always accurate. And that is precisely why learning to understand how this instant judgment works is the first step to being able to read people clearly and without distortion. Our mind has a constant need to classify reality. It doesn't do this on a whim, but for efficiency. The human brain receives thousands of stimuli per second, and it can't process them all consciously. Therefore, it has learned to use mental shortcuts called heuristics. These shortcuts allow us to make quick decisions based on past experiences, learned patterns, or unconscious associations. They are useful, no doubt, but also dangerous. Because they often lead us to jump to conclusions, to confuse signals, to judge without understanding. And in the field of human perception, this means we can label someone as arrogant when they are actually nervous. We can think someone is weak just because they avoid eye contact, or that someone is sincere just because they smile. But a smile can be a mask, and silence, a form of protection. One of the fundamental bases of this quick judgment is what psychology calls first impressions. It's such a powerful phenomenon that it can influence our entire subsequent interpretations. When we meet someone, the first thing we notice, their clothing, their posture, their facial expression, their voice, triggers a series of automatic associations in our minds. If that person resembles someone who hurt us, if their way of speaking reminds us of someone authoritarian, or if their style seems familiar to us for any reason, we are already filtering their presence through an internal story. The danger of this is that once that first impression is formed, we tend to seek evidence that confirms it and ignore evidence that contradicts it. This is what is known as confirmation bias. Thus, without realizing it, we stop observing objectively and begin to reinforce what we already believe. Another very common bias in human perception is the so-called halo effect. This occurs when a person's positive or negative characteristic influences how we perceive everything else. For example, if someone is attractive, we tend to think they are also competent, intelligent, or kind, even without proof. If someone seems confident, we assume they are also a leader, trustworthy, or successful. This effect prevents us from seeing clearly because it amplifies an initial impression into a distorted view of the whole. The same thing happens in the opposite direction. If someone makes a mistake or shows weakness, we may begin to see them as clumsy or untrustworthy, even if that judgment has no basis in reality. Our culture also shapes the way we perceive. From a young age, we learn to associate certain gestures, styles of dress, tones of voice, or ways of moving with specific values. In some cultures, eye contact is a sign of respect and openness. In others, it can be interpreted as defiance or a lack of humility. In some contexts, speaking enthusiastically is seen as a virtue. In others, as a lack of seriousness. These cultural differences aren't evident when we're immersed in our own bubble. But when we begin to read people more deeply, we need to recognize that not everyone speaks with the same code. And that if we judge from our cultural framework without considering the context, we can completely misinterpret someone's intention or emotional state. In addition to biases and cultural frameworks, there is another crucial factor in human perception, our own emotional history. What we've experienced, the wounds we carry, the relationships that shaped us, all of this is unconsciously activated when we're in front of others. If someone raises their voice and it reminds us of an authority figure from our childhood, we react from that memory, not from the present. If someone is cold or distant, and it connects us to an experience of rejection, we project that emotion onto the other. And the most delicate thing is that all of this happens without us realizing it. Therefore, we often don't perceive the other person, but rather perceive our own history projected onto them. To develop true human reading skills, we first need to become aware of these processes. Not to stop them, because they are a natural part of our cognition, but to stop being slaves to them. A mind trained to read people accurately is a mind that observes itself as it observes others. It is a mind that knows how to distinguish between what it is seeing and what it is interpreting, between what the other is expressing and what I am projecting. It is a mind that does not rush, that doubts its initial conclusions, that seeks to validate its perception with more data, with more signals, with more context. Human perception isn't a perfect tool. It's a blend of intuition, biology, culture, experience, and emotion. But when trained, it becomes a precise compass. It allows you to better navigate relationships, anticipate conflicts, recognize opportunities, detect warning signs, and connect more deeply. It's not about becoming an infallible judge of people, but rather a more lucid observer. Because when you observe clearly, you understand better. And when you understand, you make better decisions. Reading someone doesn't mean guessing what they're thinking. It means observing with sensitivity, interpreting with responsibility, and understanding with humility. It means realizing that behind every gesture there is a story, that behind every reaction there is an emotion, and that behind every expression there is an unspoken need. Human perception isn't exact, but it can become profoundly wise. And that's the power you're developing here. Not to manipulate, but to see more truly. Because seeing someone truly, beyond the masks, is a form of respect. And also a form of freedom. Chapter 2, Body Language 101. What the body says even when the mouth is silent. The human body speaks constantly, even when the mouth remains silent. Every movement, every posture, every small gesture we make sends information about our emotional state, our intentions, and even our most intimate thoughts. And it does so without us being aware of it. This silent language, known as body language, is an ancestral form of communication, predating verbal language, deeply embedded in our biology and used for millions of years to establish hierarchies, alliances, warnings, and affection within our primitive tribes. Despite the fact that today we live in a world full of words, the body continues to speak powerfully, and those who know how to listen to its message become capable of understanding the truth that is often hidden behind what is said. One of the keys to correctly interpreting body language is understanding that it's not about isolated signs, but about patterns. A single gesture can mean many things depending on the context, the culture, the person, and the moment. Crossing one's arms, for example, can indicate defense, but also coldness, habit, or even comfort. The important thing isn't to focus on a particular gesture, but rather how it combines with the rest of the body's signals and the situation in which it occurs. Therefore, the attentive reader doesn't interpret the first movement, but rather observes patiently, records in detail, and compares it with the person's baseline behavior. That baseline, how someone normally acts when emotionally at rest, is essential for detecting any significant deviation that reveals an internal change. Body postures reveal much more than we think. A person who expands, who occupies space with their shoulders back and chest open, usually feels confident, dominant, or relaxed. On the other hand, someone who shrugs their shoulders, lowers their head, and keeps their arms close to their body may be experiencing insecurity, anxiety, or a desire to go unnoticed. These signs of expansion or contraction are automatic responses the body adopts depending on how it feels at the moment. They are not conscious decisions. They are deep biological reactions linked to our need for protection or expression. The body doesn't lie when it feels comfortable or threatened. You just have to learn to read what it's communicating. Our hands are also a powerful channel for emotional expression. We use them to emphasize what we say, but also to channel tension, anxiety, or emotion. When someone is nervous, they often rub their hands together, play with objects, touch their face, or adjust their clothing. These micro-behaviors, known as manipulative or pacifying gestures, are unconscious attempts at emotional self-regulation. The brain detects discomfort, and the body responds with small actions that seek to calm that tension. Observing these types of gestures is an excellent way to detect stress, lying, or internal conflict, especially when they don't align with the verbal content being expressed. The face, although easier to consciously control, also reveals emotions with surprising clarity. Beyond broad expressions like a smile or a frown, there are micro-expressions that last only a fraction of a second, but are powerful windows into genuine emotion. These micro-signals can show anger, sadness, surprise, contempt, fear, or joy before the person manages to hide them. They are fleeting, yet intense, and those who train their visual perception can learn to detect them effortlessly over time. Observing these signals doesn't require being invasive, simply being present and attentive. Because what appears on the face at that moment reveals a real emotion, unfiltered, unthought, but simply felt. The feet, though ignored by most, are one of the most truthful indicators of body language. While the hands and face are the parts most trained to fake, the feet often act uncensored. The direction in which the feet point can reveal where a person wants to go, even if their body is oriented in a different direction. When someone is interested in a conversation, their feet tend to remain aligned with their interlocutor. If they feel uncomfortable or want to leave, their feet may begin to turn toward a door, an exit, or even slightly move away from the interaction space. Detecting these subtle movements offers clear information about a person's true disposition, beyond what they say. The rhythm of movements is also a key indicator. Quick, jerky, or repetitive movements can be related to anxiety, impatience, or internal tension. In contrast, fluid, relaxed, and slow movements usually indicate calm, confidence, and control. When someone is emotionally balanced, their movements are harmonious, congruent with what they express verbally, and show no contradiction. But when the body and words don't align, when someone says they're fine, but their body contracts, or when they affirm confidence, but their hands tremble, then the body reveals a truth that the mind tries to hide. This incongruity is one of the most revealing aspects of nonverbal communication. Illustrative gestures, those that naturally accompany speech, also offer important information. When someone speaks and their gestures flow in sync with their words, there is usually congruence and authenticity. But when gestures are delayed, forced, or completely absent, it may be a sign that the person is overly controlling their expression, hiding something, or emotionally disconnected from the content they are expressing. This isn't a fixed rule, but it is a clue that, combined with other elements, provides clarity. Synchronicity between body and speech is a sign of internal coherence, and observing this harmony or its absence is a powerful tool for those who wish to read accurately. Eye contact is another deeply significant signal. A sustained gaze can denote confidence, interest, or dominance, while averting one's gaze can be related to insecurity, guilt, submission, or simply shyness. However, context is essential here too. In some cultures, eye contact is a sign of respect. In others, it can be interpreted as a lack of courtesy. Therefore, it's not about judging the gesture itself, but rather understanding it in its relational, emotional, and cultural context. Even so, abrupt changes in gaze direction, excessive blinking, or pupil dilation can be biological signals indicating a significant emotional shift, such as fear, attraction, surprise, or discomfort. The body has its own language, and like all languages, it is learned, practiced, and perfected. You don't need to memorize hundreds of signals to be a good reader of body language. What you need is to develop a patient, open, and trained eye. You need to learn to observe without prejudice, to notice patterns, to remember a person's basic behavior, and to detect the subtle deviations that reveal their inner world. The body speaks because it is designed to do so, and whoever listens attentively will gain access to a dimension of reality that remains invisible to most. A dimension where the truth is not always spoken, but always revealed. Chapter 3. The Face Doesn't Lie. microexpressions and facial clues to emotional state. The human face is a constantly shifting emotional map. Each facial muscle has the ability to reveal internal states with such subtle precision that they often escape awareness, but not trained perception. Although words can be manipulated, although the body can fake postures or rehearse gestures, the face, in that fleeting instant before conscious control intervenes, tells the truth. It is in that brief and revealing moment that microexpressions emerge, involuntary muscular reactions that reflect real emotions, even if the person tries to hide them. They last only between 1/20th and 1/5 of a second, but they contain invaluable information. Learning to detect them and understand their meaning is like having direct access to raw emotion, before it is disguised by the social filter. Every basic emotion has a universal imprint on the face. These emotions, joy, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, disgust, and contempt, are expressed so consistently across cultures that even people born blind display the same facial configurations, indicating that they are not learned, but biological. For example, true joy activates the orbicularis oculi muscle, forming the so-called crow's feet. A fake smile, on the other hand, only engages the mouth muscles. Contempt is expressed by a slight elevation of one side of the upper lip. Surprise opens the eyes and raises the eyebrows symmetrically. Fear widens the eyes, retracts the lips, and tenses the facial muscles. These signs appear before the person has time to conceal them and are especially revealing when they contradict verbal discourse. The fascinating thing about microexpressions is that they are activated even in people with great self-control. You may be listening to someone say they are calm, but if for a split second their face shows an expression of fear, you will know that calmness is a mask. This contradiction between word and gesture is one of the clearest signs that there is a hidden emotion, unspoken, possibly denied. And even if the person is not aware of it, their face certainly reveals it. For the attentive observer, these signals are like clues that emerge at the exact moment the rational mind tries to hide what the body has already felt. You don't need to stop the conversation to notice them. You just need to be present, observe sensitively, and let your mind register what your eyes see before it disappears. One of the most common mistakes when reading facial expressions is interpreting a single signal too quickly. The face can move for multiple reasons, not all of them emotional. A raised eyebrow can be due to surprise, skepticism, or simply an automatic reaction. Rapid blinking can be due to nervousness, but also to dry eyes or fatigue. The important thing is to observe the whole picture: the duration of the gesture, its symmetry, the emotional context, and its congruence with what is being said. A good reader doesn't rush to interpret, but rather observes several signals before concluding. And above all, avoid reading malicious intent where there is only a momentary emotion. Microexpressions don't tell you what the person is going to do, but they do tell you what they are feeling at that moment. It is an emotional snapshot, not a character diagnosis. In addition to microexpressions, other facial cues offer ongoing information about emotional state. A tense jaw, for example, often indicates suppressed anger or stress. A constantly furrowed brow can signal worry, intense concentration, or irritability. Tight, inward curved lips can indicate emotional repression or resistance. Drooping corners reflect sadness or discouragement. Even the way someone moves their eyes, whether they constantly avert their eyes, stare too hard, avoid eye contact, offers clues about their comfort level, their security, or their desire to escape something. Each of these signals, on its own, tells little. But when presented in patterns and alongside other body expressions, they form a coherent narrative of a person's internal state. The face also communicates intentions, not just emotions. A slight raise of the eyebrows combined with a smile can indicate openness, a desire for connection, and genuine interest. In contrast, a closed lip smile with no eye movement can be a sign of forced politeness, a form of social mask. Observing these nuances helps distinguish between a real connection and a superficial interaction. In professional settings, these differences are crucial. Knowing when someone is truly engaged or just acting can help you decide how to respond, how to move forward, or how to protect your energy. In personal relationships, recognizing a genuine emotion can be the gateway to a deeper, more honest, and more transformative conversation. There are people who have trained their faces to show little. They are those who have experienced situations where showing emotion was a risk, a vulnerability. But even they have moments when their face betrays their attempt at control. A slight hardening of the gaze, a micro-gesture of displeasure, or a barely perceptible muscle hesitation can reveal what their voice would never convey. And if you know how to see that, you don't need to confront. Simply register, understand, and adjust your perception. Because face reading is not a weapon for judging, but a tool for understanding. It's not about using it to manipulate, but to connect more deeply, knowing that behind every expression lies a story, an emotional world, and, often, an invisible struggle. You don't need to be an expert in facial recognition to begin noticing these details. What you need is presence. To stop looking at your phone, stop thinking about what you're going to say, and observe. The human face is an open book, but only for those who know how to read between the lines. Emotions aren't expressed with words, but with electrical impulses that move muscles without asking permission. And that's where the emotional truth lies, the one that often the person hasn't even consciously recognized. Seeing it is an act of sensitivity. Understanding it is an act of compassion. And using that understanding responsibly is what distinguishes the observer from the merely looking. Because the face doesn't lie, but it does demand attention. And once you fine-tune your gaze, the emotional world of others begins to reveal itself in every gesture, every glance, every microsecond. Chapter 4. The Art of Listening to Silence. Pauses, Tone, and Emotional Subtext. Listening is much more than hearing what someone says. It's entering into the hidden rhythm of a conversation, capturing what isn't said, interpreting the tone, the pauses, the hesitations, the sighs. In human communication, words represent only a small part of the real message. What's truly revealing happens in the subtext, in the way things are said, in the moment of silence, in the energy that surrounds each sentence. Listening to silence isn't a poetic metaphor. It's a concrete, practical, powerful skill. Because silence isn't empty, but condensed emotional content. Sometimes, what isn't said screams louder than any statement. And whoever knows how to perceive those spaces between words accesses a deeper level of human understanding. One of the most revealing elements of paraverbal communication is the tone of voice. Tone conveys not only the content of a message, but also the emotional intent behind it. The same sentence can sound friendly, sarcastic, aggressive, or fearful, depending on the tone. Tone tells us whether a person is relaxed or tense, confident or insecure, interested or distant. It is the emotional color of the word, the vibration that runs through the message. And often, it is more honest than the words themselves. When someone says, "It's okay," in a dry, sharp, or hurried tone, we know they are not okay. When someone says, "It's nothing," while their voice trembles or cracks, we understand that something is happening. Tone reveals what language is trying to conceal. Therefore, training our ears to capture tonal variations is not a luxury, but a necessity for those who wish to read the emotional truth in others. Pauses also communicate. They aren't simply gaps between sentences. They're spaces where the unconscious mind acts. A pause before answering can reveal hesitation, calculation, insecurity, or even lying. A prolonged pause after an awkward question may indicate that the person is reorganizing their speech to avoid saying something. On the other hand, quick, thoughtless answers sometimes mask anxiety or defensiveness. Knowing how to observe the rhythm of speech, when someone speeds up, when they stop, when they repeat a word, allows us to understand how they are feeling beyond what they say. The speed at which someone speaks is also a reflection of their internal state. Someone who is nervous tends to speak faster, with fewer pauses, as if they need to vent quickly. Someone who is calm usually has a slower, firmer, more consistent rhythm. Sighs, changes in breathing, throat clearings, unnatural silences, all of these are part of sonorous nonverbal language. We don't always notice them because we're too busy preparing our next response. But if we learn to quiet not only our voice, but also our impulse to intervene, we begin to notice what previously went unnoticed. The sigh before answering, the lowering of our voice when an emotional topic is touched upon, the slightest break on a key word. These are signs that there's something more going on, something that isn't being directly stated. And that's precisely where emotional truth lies. Not in what's explicit, but in what's suggested. Not in what's said, but in what's contained. Emotional subtext is the deep layer of every verbal exchange. It's what is felt behind what is said. It's the emotion that underlies every word. And although often not even the person speaking is aware of their subtext, their body, their voice, their silences express it without permission. For example, someone may say, "Nice to see you" in words, but their cold tone, evasive gaze, and tense posture reveal discomfort. The verbal content says one thing, the emotional subtext says another. Reading this contrast is a skill that is trained by observing, listening, but above all, feeling. Because subtext is not only analyzed, it is also perceived. It is an emotional vibration that arrives even before the words are arranged. One of the most powerful signs of emotional subtext is incongruity. When verbal and paraverbal input don't match, when the tone doesn't fit the content, when pauses don't make sense with the discourse, something is out of place. This inconsistency doesn't always mean a lie, but it does signal an internal tension, an emotion that isn't being directly expressed. And that's where the attentive reader focuses their attention. Not to confront, not to question, but to understand more deeply. Because every time there's a contradiction between what is said and how it's said, a window opens into what the person is truly feeling. Furthermore, the way someone responds emotionally to certain words or topics can give us clues about their wounds, beliefs, or insecurities. For example, if when mentioning an authority figure someone lowers their tone, speeds up their responses, or becomes more evasive, they may have unresolved emotional baggage regarding that topic. If when discussing emotional ties someone avoids long pauses or quickly changes the subject, they may be avoiding a deep emotion. These patterns aren't absolute proof, but they are signals that, when repeated, reveal an underlying emotional structure. Listening for this requires more than analysis. It requires empathy, intuition, and practice. Another crucial part of listening to silence is learning to endure it. In many cultures, silence is uncomfortable. It's quickly filled with empty words, excuses, or automatic phrases. But in reality, silence has a transformative power. It's in those seconds of emptiness that authenticity emerges. Those who know how to remain silent after asking a question, for example, allow the other person to connect with themselves, to drop their mask, to reveal what they truly think or feel. Sometimes, it's necessary to sustain that emptiness for a few seconds longer for the truth to emerge. Not everyone knows how to do this. Those who manage to do it access levels of depth impossible to reach when the words don't stop. The art of listening beyond words also involves training in presence. Because only by being truly present, with all your attention focused on the other, can you capture what isn't being said. Listen with your whole body, not just your ears. Perceive the pauses, the tone, the rhythm, the silences, the inflections. Feel the message behind the message. This form of listening isn't passive. It's active, engaged, and sensitive. And it's precisely what allows you to see the invisible, grasp the implicit, and understand what no one is saying, but what everyone is feeling. When you develop this skill, you become a silent mirror for the other. Someone who not only listens, but perceives. And that silent but powerful perception completely changes the way you relate to others. Because you no longer remain on the surface of discourse, but are immersed in the emotional truth of the moment. Chapter 5. Establish a reference point. Context changes everything. All human behavior is relative. No gesture, expression, or reaction has a single, universal, and immutable meaning. Everything a person does, says, or displays is inevitably influenced by their emotional state, personal history, culture, immediate environment, and a myriad of contextual factors. Therefore, if you want to truly understand someone, if your goal is to read accurately and without error, you must learn to establish a baseline, an individual reference point from which you can compare any significant deviations. Without that reference point, every interpretation is a gamble, a dangerous assumption. With that reference point, however, you can read with a clarity that few possess, because you are guided not by generalities, but by specific, real patterns unique to the person in front of you. Baseline is the natural form of behavior a person displays when they're not under pressure, when they're not trying to impress or hide anything. It's the state of emotional rest from which they act spontaneously and without a filter. Observing someone in this state allows you to record how they move, how they express themselves, how they breathe, how they respond when they're not emotionally activated. It's like calibrating an instrument before using it. You need to know what normal sounds like to know when it's out of tune. The same thing happens with people. If someone normally speaks with their hands and suddenly holds them rigid, that's significant. If they usually make natural eye contact and suddenly constantly look away, something is happening. But you can only detect this variation if you first paid attention to baseline behavior. Establishing this baseline requires non-judgmental observation. It's not about evaluating whether what the person is doing seems right or not, but rather recording their behavior without making them feel observed or analyzed. Therefore, informal moments, relaxed spaces, and spontaneous conversations are ideal for building this map. You don't need hours to do it. In just a few minutes of neutral conversation, you can see how someone behaves when they're not emotionally upset. Make a mental note of the rhythm of their voice, the level of eye contact, their body position, their way of laughing, and how they respond to simple questions. This pattern is your point of comparison. It doesn't matter what the theory says. What matters is how that particular person behaves when they're calm, authentic, and under no pressure. The big mistake many make when trying to read others is applying universal interpretations without considering the context or individual patterns. They believe that crossing their arms always means defense, that averting eye contact always indicates lying, that smiling is always a sign of openness. But these conclusions are only valid if they are contrasted with the person's habitual behavior. Some people cross their arms out of habit or because they feel cold. Others avoid eye contact out of shyness or cultural respect. Others smile, even when uncomfortable, because they have learned to use a smile as a shield. Without a baseline, every gesture becomes ambiguous. With a baseline, any change becomes a clear message. Furthermore, context changes everything. You can't interpret a gesture the same way in a job interview, a romantic discussion, or at a casual dinner with friends. Social pressure, expectations from the environment, the type of relationship between people, the topic being discussed, all these elements directly influence how someone behaves. A person may appear more rigid when standing in front of an authority figure, or more relaxed when talking about a topic they're passionate about. They may appear evasive not because they're hiding something, but because the environment is uncomfortable or they feel they're being judged. Reading a person without considering the environment is like analyzing a word outside of its sentence. You can guess its meaning, but you'll be playing with half-truths. Even the physical state at the moment affects expression. Fatigue, hunger, pain, or discomfort influence posture, tone of voice, attention, and emotional response. Someone who has barely slept may seem apathetic or disconnected, but this does not mean a lack of interest. A sick person may react with more irritability or sensitivity, but this does not indicate an underlying problem. Therefore, careful observation also involves questioning, validating, and contextualizing. It's not enough to see a sign. You have to understand why it's there, whether it's common or an exception, whether it has internal roots or is a reaction to something external. An effective technique for confirming whether a behavior is consistent or an anomaly is to provoke subtle changes in the interaction. Change the subject, introduce an emotional question, modify your tone. Observe how the person responds. If their behavior changes drastically when faced with certain stimuli, it gives you clues about their sensitive points, their insecurities, or their areas of tension. This type of dynamic calibration is used by communication experts, negotiators, and behavior analysts. It's not about manipulation, but about obtaining real data that allows you to interpret more accurately. You don't react to a gesture. You analyze its coherence with the whole picture, its distance from the baseline, its relationship to the context. Learning to establish this individual reference makes you a more human and less mechanical reader. You no longer rely on rigid lists of meanings, but instead develop a living, adaptive, and flexible map. Because each person is a unique universe, with their own codes, their own expressions, their own emotional history. Reading from this understanding allows you to avoid erroneous judgments, improve your relationships, and respond more intelligently. You become more empathetic, but also more accurate. Because you don't confuse the apparent with the true, nor the superficial with the essential. And the most valuable thing is that this level of mindful observation not only improves your ability to understand others, but also strengthens your presence. It makes you more attentive, quieter within, more receptive. You train yourself to see without immediately reacting, to process before concluding, to validate before judging. And that kind of presence isn't just felt, it's transmitted. People perceive when they are truly being seen, without prejudice, without hidden agendas, without needing approval. And in that space, a more genuine, more transparent, more human connection opens up. Context isn't something extra. It's the framework within which everything makes sense. Human behavior isn't interpreted in a vacuum. It's interpreted in relation to time, space, emotion, culture, history, and the specific person expressing it. Learning to establish a baseline and read from context isn't simply a technique. It's a profound shift in approach. You stop looking for signs to confirm what you already believe and start observing to discover what really is. You stop projecting your ideas onto others and begin allowing their behaviors to speak for themselves within their real framework. And that rare and powerful ability is what allows you to understand any person instantly, accurately, without imposing, without forcing, simply by observing with attention, respect, and awareness. Chapter 6: Fatal Mistakes When Reading Someone. Assumptions, Judgments, and Projections. One of the biggest obstacles to truly understanding people isn't a lack of skill, but an excess of unfounded certainties. We think we know more than we actually do. We cling to quick interpretations. We allow ourselves to be carried away by stereotypes, miscalibrated intuitions, invisible biases that distort what we see. And the most dangerous thing is that these distortions don't feel like mistakes. They feel like absolute truths. Therefore, the first great enemy of the human reader is assumption. Assuming is constructing a story about another without evidence, filling in the gaps with our own ideas, believing that a signal has only one meaning because our experience dictates it. But every assumption that isn't validated is a possibility for error. Every time you interpret without questioning, without observing deeply, without considering that person's context or history, you are telling yourself a version of yourself, not theirs. And that's where self-deception begins. Assumptions are born, in large part, from the desire to be right. We want to confirm what we already think, not discover something new. So when we see a signal that seems to match our beliefs, we jump to the unvalidated conclusion. This is confirmation bias in action. We look for signals that reinforce our prior perception, and we ignore or minimize those that contradict it. If you think someone is arrogant, you'll interpret their silence as contempt. If you think someone is weak, you'll see their soft tone as a sign of submission. But those interpretations don't come from the other person, they come from you. And if you're not aware of that, you're reading your mind, not theirs. Another common and fatal error is hasty judgment. Judging is labeling without understanding. It's deciding who someone is based on a single gesture, a word, an expression, without taking the time to look beyond. When you judge, you stop observing. You're no longer open to what the person is really showing. You're seeking to confirm your label. And in that act, you not only close yourself off from the truth, but you also close off the space for connection. No one feels truly seen when they're being judged. Judgment blocks empathy, shuts off curiosity, sabotages listening. Reading others well requires suspending judgment, even when the signs seem obvious. Because in human behavior, what's obvious is often just a facade. The real thing is often behind it, in the subtle, in the contradictory, in what hasn't yet been revealed. Perhaps the deepest trap is projection. Projecting is seeing in others what we carry within. It is attributing to them intentions, emotions, or conflicts that are actually our own. When we haven't worked through our wounds, fears, or insecurities, we tend to see them reflected in others. If you distrust yourself, you will believe others are lying. If you have a history of abandonment, you will interpret distance as rejection. If you carry guilt, you will see judgment where there is only silence. Projection is not easily noticed because it is experienced as reality. We don't feel we are projecting. We feel we are seeing clearly. But in reality, we are coloring the other person with our history. And until we are aware of this tendency, our reading of people will be tainted. Avoiding these mental traps requires a deep level of self-awareness. It means observing not only the other person, but yourself as you observe. Constantly asking yourself, am I seeing what's really happening or what I expect to see? Am I interpreting based on data or based on my need for confirmation? Am I understanding the other person or am I reacting to my own emotional history? These questions don't have a single answer, but keeping them alive within you protects you from error, keeps you humble, and forces you to remain curious and open. Because curiosity is the antidote to judgment. When you're genuinely interested in understanding, you stop imposing and begin to discover. Another critical mistake is believing that reading people gives you power over them. This mindset turns observation into manipulation. The true goal of understanding someone isn't to control them, it's to connect with more truth. It's not about using what you see to achieve something, but to be more present, more aligned, more respectful of the other person's reality. If you use your reading ability to force, manipulate, or impose, you will lose the sensitivity necessary to read accurately. Because true reading demands emotional neutrality. You can't clearly see if your desire to control is activated. You can't accurately interpret whether your ego wants to be right. The mind that desires power doesn't perceive, it only reacts. But the mind that is emptied of intention can see what others don't. Another common mistake is generalizing, thinking that what works for one person applies to everyone. Every human being has their own emotional code, their own internal language, their own gestures, their unique way of expressing themselves. Reading accurately means personalizing each observation. It means remembering that what one person does doesn't have the same meaning for another. Generalizing is more convenient, but also more inaccurate. It gives you speed, but takes away depth. And those who seek to truly understand sacrifice speed for truth. We must also be careful about interpreting emotions without checking. Just because someone shows signs of tension doesn't mean they're lying. Just because someone avoids a question doesn't mean they have something to hide. Emotions are complex, multi-causal, and often contradictory. A person can be nervous for multiple reasons: insecurity, pressure, fear of being judged, trauma, fatigue. If you don't ask questions, if you don't give space, if you don't ask valid questions, you can build an erroneous judgment on an incomplete emotional foundation. Accuracy in human reading comes not from knowing a lot, but from observing closely, doubting your first interpretations, and having the courage to ask real questions. Interpretation without validation is also a silent trap. We often believe we already understand what someone feels or thinks, and we act accordingly, without checking if it's true. We jump the gun, we make assumptions, and in doing so, we create misunderstandings, conflicts, or unnecessary distance. Validation isn't interrogating. It's offering a space for the other person to confirm or correct your perception. It can be as simple as saying, "Were you uncomfortable with that?" Or, "I get the feeling this is affecting you, is that right?" This openness not only improves your accuracy but also strengthens the bond. Because the other person senses that you're genuinely interested in understanding, not in being right. Avoiding these errors doesn't require perfection, but rather constant awareness. It's about training a clear gaze, honest listening, a true desire to understand without imposing. Human reading is both an art and a discipline. It is cultivated in silence, in pause, in the humility of not knowing, in the willingness to learn in every encounter. When you recognize your own projections, your automatic judgments, your assumptions disguised as certainty, you begin to see with different eyes. And those eyes, freer, more attentive, more empty of ego, allow you to perceive what others cannot. The silent truth behind every gesture, the emotion that goes unnamed, the story that has yet to be told. That is the reading that transforms. Not the one that dominates, but the one that connects. Not the one that gets it right, but the one that understands. Because understanding is not being right. It is seeing deeply and without distortion. And that vision is the foundation of every true human relationship. Chapter 7: Emotional Neutrality. How to become an objective observer. Becoming a true reader of human behavior requires not only technical knowledge, but also an internal transformation. Developing the ability to observe without contaminating what you see with your own emotional baggage. Emotional neutrality is not coldness or indifference, but mental clarity. It is the ability to see what is happening without distorting it through your personal filters. When your emotions are unregulated, what you observe is not the other person, but your reaction to them. And that reaction, often automatic, biased, or impulsive, clouds your perception and distances you from the truth. Being an objective observer doesn't mean not feeling, but rather knowing when what you are feeling is interfering with your reading of others. The first key to cultivating this neutrality is developing awareness of your own filters. We all have them. Some arise from past experiences, others from emotional wounds, others from limiting beliefs or learned ideas. We filter reality with what we think we know, with what we fear, with what we desire. If, for example, you have a personal history with authoritarian people, you might interpret firmness as a threat. If you have suffered betrayal, you might see distrust where there is only reserve. Recognizing that your interpretations are not always clean is the first step to clearing them. As long as you are unaware of your filters, they will decide for you what you see. The second step is to train ourselves to pause. Most of our reactions are automatic because we don't leave any space between the stimulus and our interpretation. Someone crosses their arms, and we think, they're defensive. Someone avoids our gaze, and we say, they're lying. But if we learn to pause, to suspend judgment for a few seconds, we begin to see more details. Pausing allows you to observe without responding immediately. It gives you the opportunity to notice whether your interpretation comes from the present or your past. It's in that space, between what's happening and what you choose to think, that neutrality is born. Without pausing, you react. With pausing, you choose how to observe. Another essential technique for maintaining objectivity is conscious breathing. It may seem like a minor thing, but it's actually a powerful tool for regulating your emotions in real time. When your breathing is deep, slow, and conscious, your nervous system calms, your mind focuses, and your capacity for observation is amplified. Shallow, rapid, and labored breathing, on the other hand, indicates that you're being swept away by your own emotions. If, before interpreting a situation, you inhale deeply, hold it for a few seconds, and then exhale slowly, you give your body a signal of reassurance, taking it out of reactive mode and entering observer mode. This simple practice can make the difference between seeing clearly and reacting with distortion. Objectivity also requires humility. Because to see without judgment, you need to accept that you don't know everything, that what you're seeing can have multiple interpretations, that your perception is just one possibility among many. When you approach others from a place of certainty, you're no longer observing. You're defending your own point. But when you approach others from a place of curiosity, from a genuine desire to understand, then you can see beyond the obvious. Humility opens the door to understanding. It allows you to ask questions instead of assuming. It gives you permission to doubt, to correct yourself, to adjust your perspective when you notice it's not objective. And that mental flexibility is a form of advanced emotional intelligence. A powerful practice for clearing your automatic reactions is self-inquiry. Every time you interpret a signal and feel a strong emotional response, stop and ask yourself, what is making me feel this? What part of me is reacting? Does this reaction have more to do with me or the other person? Am I seeing with my eyes or with my wounds? This practice isn't easy. It requires honesty, courage, and a commitment to your personal growth. But over time, it helps you separate what belongs to others from what belongs to you. And that separation is key. Because if you don't know how to differentiate your internal world from your external world, you'll end up projecting your unresolved emotions onto others. It's also important to understand that neutrality doesn't mean insensitivity. It's not about shutting down your emotions, but rather about not letting them dominate you. You can feel empathy, you can feel connection, you can even be deeply moved by what you observe. The important thing is that this feeling doesn't cloud your analytical capacity. Emotion felt with awareness doesn't interfere. It enriches. The emotion you don't recognize, that controls you, that takes over your judgment, is what distances you from objectivity. Therefore, one of the greatest acts of internal power is learning to sustain your emotions without letting them govern your decisions. The practice of meditative observation can also help you. Observing someone with total presence, without needing to immediately interpret, without the urgency to understand, simply being there, perceiving every gesture, every word, every silence, is an exercise that strengthens your neutrality. You're not analyzing with your mind. You're perceiving with your whole being. And from that broad perception, without judgment, the deepest understanding often emerges. Because when you stop wanting to understand, you simply understand. The mind quiets, and the body begins to read what it has always been able to grasp. Another essential aspect of this neutrality is learning not to take anything personally. What the other person does, says, or shows doesn't always have to do with you. Often, people are trapped in their own internal processes, their struggles, their fears. If you react from the ego, you'll believe everything is an attack, an offense, a threat. But if you observe from the center, you understand that you are not the axis of their emotion. And by not taking it personally, you maintain your clarity, your peace, your ability to see beyond the form. This is one of the most powerful skills you can develop in any human relationship. Ultimately, constant practice is what consolidates this transformation. Emotional neutrality isn't achieved with a single exercise, but with a habit of awareness. Every day, every conversation, every encounter is an opportunity to observe yourself as you observe. To notice your impulses, your biases, your automatisms. To breathe, pause, correct. To return to presence. And over time, this way of seeing becomes your natural state. You no longer need to make as much effort, because you have become someone who doesn't need to react to feel that they exist, someone who can see without needing to immediately interpret, someone who can hold the mystery of the other without the anxiety of wanting to define it. That is the true mastery of the human observer. It isn't knowing everything, but knowing how to be quiet inside to see clearly. It isn't having all the answers, but knowing how to ask the right questions. It isn't imposing a reading, but allowing the other's truth to reveal itself at its own pace. Being emotionally neutral is being so present with yourself that you can truly be present with others. And from that presence, every gesture, every word, every silence becomes a clear, profound, human message. That is the difference between looking and seeing, between listening and understanding, between supposing and knowing. And whoever masters this difference masters the art of understanding any person instantly. Chapter 8. Detecting lies without confronting. Signs, strategies, and patterns. Detecting a lie isn't a matter of confrontation, aggression, or constant mistrust, but rather a matter of sensitivity, keen observation, and a deep understanding of human behavior. Lying, by its nature, requires a cognitive and emotional effort that leaves traces, subtle signals, and internal contradictions that seep into the way a person speaks, moves, or responds. No one can lie with absolute perfection for long, because the human body, when under stress, reveals what the mind is trying to hide. But to perceive it, one needs not to be an interrogator, but a silent observer, someone who doesn't seek to trap, but rather to clearly understand what is happening, without imposing, without accusing, without turning the conversation into a battle. One of the most revealing elements when detecting deception is the incongruity between verbal and nonverbal communication. When someone says one thing, but their body communicates something else, this mismatch is a red flag. For example, someone claims to be calm while their voice trembles, their shoulders tense, or their feet point toward the exit. Or they say they're confident, but cross their arms, purse their lips, or look away at just the right moment. These tiny gaps between words and gestures indicate that the mind is trying to control the discourse, but the body can't help but express the emotional truth that runs through it. And that truth, when repeated in certain patterns, is what betrays the lie without it being necessary to make a single accusation. Pauses are also powerful indicators. Lying requires mental construction. The person who lies isn't recalling something from their experience, but rather inventing something believable. This process, even if rapid, generates micropauses, hesitations, unnecessary repetitions, or overly detailed answers. A liar often gives more information than requested, as if trying to fill in the blanks before it becomes apparent that there's no real substance. In contrast, when someone tells the truth, the story flows more naturally, without as much embellishment or rigidity. The truth doesn't need protection, only storytelling. A lie, on the other hand, is sustained with effort, and that effort is evident in the structure of the response. Another key technique for detecting deception without confrontation is asking questions from different angles. A false narrative is harder to sustain when its order, focus, or context is changed. For example, if someone is telling a story, you can ask them to tell it backward or to detail specific parts they didn't mention before. A liar often contradicts himself, changes his version, forgets details, or becomes inconsistent. This shouldn't be done as an ambush, but rather with an open, calm attitude, almost as if you're simply curious. The goal isn't to provoke fear, but to invite the inconsistency to come to light. Body language is also a treasure trove of signals. Facial microexpressions, for example, can betray an emotional state that is incompatible with what is being said. Someone who claims to be happy but furrows their brow slightly or clenches their jaw is revealing internal tension. Self-comforting behaviors can also be observed, such as rubbing their hands together, touching their neck, scratching their face, or hiding their palms. These gestures are not definitive proof, but when they accumulate and coincide with other elements, they significantly increase the likelihood of concealment. The key is to detect changes from the person's habitual baseline. It's not that a specific gesture alone indicates a lie, but rather its sudden appearance, coupled with an emotionally sensitive situation, signals a possible imbalance. A silent and effective technique is to observe the emotional reaction when asking key questions. If, when you touch on a specific topic, the person changes their tone of voice, averts their gaze, stiffens, or repeats words, they may be facing internal dissonance. This dissonance isn't always synonymous with lying, but it does indicate discomfort, something worth exploring further. Ideally, you shouldn't point out the change directly, but rather continue exploring naturally, so that the person relaxes and allows more signals to emerge without feeling cornered. It's important to clarify that detecting a lie shouldn't be intended to humiliate, punish, or exert power over the other person. Accurate detection of deception serves, above all, to protect you, to make more informed decisions, and to know where you stand in a conversation or relationship. When someone lies, they do so out of fear, defense, necessity, or habit. Understanding this allows the reading not to become judgment, but clarity. And that clarity is enough. It's not always necessary to confront. Sometimes, simply knowing what's going on is the smartest thing to do. And that knowledge is elegantly maintained when it doesn't become an attack, but a conscious presence. An advanced practice is to observe how a person's behavior changes before and after a lie. Often, after telling something false, the body reacts with relief or tension. Some slump their shoulders as if they've passed a test. Others quickly glance at their interlocutor to see if the lie was accepted. Some give a nervous smile, others remain silent for longer than usual. These micro-events, observed carefully, reveal much more than words. Because the body doesn't know how to lie as well as the mind tries. The tone of voice also changes when someone is lying. It may become higher-pitched, drier, or more choppy. The speed of speech may increase or decrease abruptly. These changes occur because the nervous system is responding to internal stress. Lying activates a series of physiological mechanisms: altered breathing, sweating, muscle tension, increased heart rate. Although these signals are not directly visible, their side effects appear in behavior. The art lies in perceiving these subtle changes without interrupting the natural flow of the conversation. An elegant strategy for generating clarity is to rephrase what you've been told and return it as a statement. For example, "So, if I understood correctly, you were at that location from 7 to 9, correct?" This feedback forces the person to reaffirm their version, and often, on that second attempt, doubts, omissions, or corrections that weren't there before appear. A truth-teller calmly confirms it. A liar often gets tangled up trying to maintain coherence. And you're not pressuring, you're just confirming. It's in that gentleness that the observer finds their power. Detecting lies without confrontation is an act of emotional intelligence, of internal mastery, of expanded listening. It's not about playing detective, but about developing a fine perception, free of judgment, capable of seeing without needing to accuse. The greater the neutrality, the greater the precision. The less emotionally involved you are with the need to uncover a lie, the more sensitive you will be to detecting it. Because the ego that wants to be right, the pride that wants to expose the other, often cloud perception. But the mind that is calm, that observes with detachment, that doesn't need to confirm anything, simply sees. And in that tension-free vision, the falsehood crumbles on its own. When you master this ability, you can move confidently in any environment. You're not easily fooled, you don't react with anxiety, you don't get carried away by appearances. You read between the lines, you listen beyond the words, you pick up on the shifts, the micro-doubts, the pauses, the silences. And when something doesn't fit, you know you don't need to prove anything. You just need to notice the incongruity, adjust your perception, and act from that clarity. No drama, no struggle, no confrontation. Just understanding. That's the true intelligence behind detecting lies. Not unmasking, but understanding without falling into the trap. Seeing the truth without needing to shout it out. Sensing the falsehood without letting it affect you. And moving from that inner peace that only those who no longer need to be right have, because they have already learned to see with the eyes of silence and discernment. Chapter 9. Asking to Reveal. Interview Techniques and Strategic Conversation. Asking the right questions can reveal more than 1,000 hours of silent observation. Words, when used with precision and awareness, not only communicate, but also open inner doors in others, unlock hidden truths, expose deep intentions, and dismantle defenses that would otherwise remain sealed. But it's not simply a matter of asking questions for the sake of asking. Asking well is an art. It's understanding that the how, when, and tone with which a question is asked carry as much weight as the question itself. In a strategic conversation, true power lies not in the number of questions you ask, but in the quality of what they provoke in the person receiving them. The first rule for effective questioning is to abandon the interrogator mindset. When someone feels scrutinized or evaluated, their defenses are immediately activated. They shut down, protect themselves, and begin to give safe, social, predictable answers. However, when the question is born from genuine curiosity, from an empathetic presence, from a clear intention, the other person senses it. They relax. They begin to open up internal spaces they don't normally reveal. The key is in your internal energy when asking questions. If you ask questions to control, manipulate, or direct, you won't get the truth. But if you ask questions to truly understand, from a place of humility and genuine interest, then you become a catalyst for honesty. There are different types of questions, and each one serves a different purpose. Open-ended questions are the most powerful for eliciting truth because they allow the other person to respond from their inner world, without limitations. Instead of asking, "Are you okay?" you can say, "How have you been feeling lately with all of this?" Instead of, "Was that difficult?" say, "What was the most challenging thing for you at that moment?" This way of asking invites the other person to explore, not defend themselves. And that's where authentic answers emerge, not edited versions of reality. Another type of strategic question explores subtle contradictions without confrontation. For example, if someone said an experience was positive, but their body language showed discomfort, you might say, "I'm interested in understanding something. You said it was positive, but I got the impression that something wasn't so easy. Is that right?" This question isn't accusatory, but rather reflective and offers a bridge for the person to open up. Often, people don't lie out of malice, but out of fear, habit, or a need to protect their image. If you give them a dignified way out, if you allow them to correct themselves without feeling exposed, they'll reveal more than you imagine. There are also mirror questions, those that return an idea for the other person to re-examine. For example, if someone says, "I don't care what other people think," you can respond, "Was it always this way for you, or is it something you've learned over time?" This kind of question leads the other person to delve deeper into their own story. It doesn't seek a direct answer, but rather to provoke introspection. And in that process, many truths emerge without you having to apply pressure. Because the power of a question isn't in eliciting a quick answer, but in sowing a concern that, little by little, undoes the masks. Pacing also matters. Asking too many questions in a row can be overwhelming or uncomfortable. The ideal is to alternate between questions and silences. Silences, when used well, are extremely powerful tools. After an answer, if you remain silent and maintain friendly eye contact, the person is likely to continue talking. Because the human mind detests an unresolved void. And it is in that space, often, that the truth emerges. Not through pressure, but through presence. Silence is an invisible container where the other person can feel free to expand. An advanced strategy is to ask questions that connect with specific emotions. People open up more about their truth when they feel emotionally touched. For example, "What exactly did you feel when that happened?" Or, "What was the moment that most affected you during that entire experience?" These questions don't seek data, but rather experiences. And by connecting with emotions, defenses are lowered. People remember what they experienced, but especially what they felt. And it's from that emotional memory that authenticity emerges. It's also essential to pay attention to how the other person responds. If they give vague answers, if they avoid certain topics, if they subtly change the subject, that's valuable information. You don't need to point it out. You can just come back later with another question, from a different angle, with a different approach. The truth doesn't always reveal itself immediately. Sometimes it needs time, reassurance, and context. And you, as a strategic reader, must have the patience to allow it to emerge in its own time. You don't push. you accompany. One of the most powerful tools in in-depth interviews is the triangulation technique. It involves asking 3 different questions about the same event from different angles. If the answers are consistent, they are likely true. If they vary significantly, there is an inconsistency worth exploring. This isn't done mechanically, but rather integrated into a natural conversation. Those who master this technique can debunk false narratives without raising suspicion or generating confrontation. Just let the inconsistencies speak for themselves. Another valuable approach is to ask questions from the future. Instead of staying in the past or the present, you can ask, how would you like that to evolve? Or, what would happen if that were repeated? These questions project the person into a new mental landscape, where desires, fears, and motivations that weren't previously explicit often emerge. The future, although imaginary, is fertile ground for revealing latent truths, because it shows where the person is emotionally inclined, and that is just as revealing as what they've experienced. And finally, there's the ability to ask without words. Sometimes a sustained gaze, a gesture, a leaning of the body can function as implicit questions. The other feels they must say something, explain something, complete something. These unspoken questions are possible only when your presence is strong, when you are totally focused, when your listening is so deep that the other feels they have permission to be completely sincere. That's when the magic happens. Because you didn't ask to obtain, but to release. And that is felt. It is perceived. And it transforms. Asking to reveal is not a mechanical technique. It's a dance between 2 consciousnesses. One that opens and the other that facilitates. One that holds something and the other that invites. If you learn to be that presence that invites, that welcomes, that knows how to sustain silence, then you will discover that the truth doesn't need to be extracted. It just needs to feel safe to come out. And you, from that energy of respect, clarity, and emotional intelligence, can become the kind of person with whom others feel they can be themselves without fear. That is the greatest achievement of a strategic conversation. Not extracting information, but opening the other's heart without touching it. Because truth, like trust, is not demanded. It is deserved. And those who know how to ask from the soul always obtain the most valuable response. Truth without effort, sincerity without pressure, connection without masks. Chapter 10. The Art of Cold Analysis. How to think like a professional profiler. Thinking like a professional profiler doesn't mean becoming some kind of diviner of human behavior, nor a mystical reader of hidden signals. It means cultivating a disciplined, cold, analytical gaze, capable of connecting facts, observing patterns, detecting inconsistencies, and constructing a complete picture of the other person based on what they reveal and, above all, what they omit. Cold analysis isn't dehumanizing. On the contrary, it's a tool for understanding more deeply, without falling into emotional judgments, misguided intuitions, or impulsive impressions. It's about observing with the same precision as a surgeon, without haste, without attachment, without assumptions. A professional profiler doesn't need the other person to confess everything. It's enough to read the data they inadvertently leave behind. The first step to thinking like a profiler is training your attention. Not a scattered or vigilant attention, but a selective attention, focused on key details. Every person has a set of repeating patterns. Ways of speaking, typical reactions to stress, automatic gestures, language choices. Observing these patterns is essential to establishing a baseline, that is, that person's normal way of behaving. The profiler doesn't interpret anything before establishing that baseline. They don't take a step further without knowing what someone is like when they're not under pressure. Because only then can they notice when something changes, when something atypical or dissonant appears. And in change, there is truth. Once that foundation is established, the profiler begins to look for micro-variations. At what point does the voice speed up? At what point in the speech does the person repeat themselves? What topic do they avoid? Where do pauses appear that weren't there before? These observations aren't made with anxiety or with the intention of jumping to conclusions. On the contrary, cold thinking requires patience. The most common mistake of the amateur observer is to interpret too quickly. The professional waits, makes mental notes. Observe how behavior evolves over time. Consistency, or the lack of it, says much more than an isolated gesture. A good profiler not only observes the individual, but also the environment. People don't behave the same in all contexts. Some expand when faced with powerful figures, others withdraw. Some are friendly in public but curt in private. The congruence between personality and context is key. Therefore, the profiler observes how someone changes around different types of people. Do they adapt easily or do they strive to please? Do they maintain their communication style or modify it drastically? Do they seek to please, dominate, or go unnoticed? All of this shapes the map of their real personality, not their social one. Another aspect that the cold analyst develops is sensitivity to language. Every word chosen, every expression used, every way of structuring a sentence provides information. Some use sweeping statements to avoid doubt. Others skirt around the topic without touching the core. Some always justify their decisions. Others impose them. Some use emotional language. Others take refuge in the rational. Listening is not just about understanding what is being said, but also about noticing how it is said. The style of speech reveals the style of thinking. And those who master this art can draw a psychological profile simply by observing how someone expresses themselves throughout a conversation. Detecting inconsistencies is another key tool. The profiler doesn't look for irrefutable evidence, but rather for tensions in the narrative, small cracks. If someone says they don't care about a topic, but mentions it 5 times in a conversation, that's relevant. If someone appears relaxed, but their gestures reflect tension, there's something there. Inconsistencies aren't errors, they're signals. But it's not about making accusations or drawing immediate conclusions. It's about accumulating data until a pattern emerges. Because human behavior can be deceptive in the short term, but in the long term, it always reveals its true form. The profiler knows how to wait for that form to reveal itself. An advanced tool is behavioral mapping. This involves mentally recording a person's reactions to similar stimuli over time. For example, if they change their posture every time you ask them about a certain topic, or if they lower their gaze when receiving praise, or if they turn their body slightly when faced with difficult questions, these patterns have meaning. It's not about obsessing over every movement, but rather identifying recurring sequences. Cold analysis doesn't look for exceptions, it looks for regularities. And when it finds them, it has a solid basis for reading accurately. It's also essential to learn to differentiate between reaction and strategy. Some people act spontaneously, others manipulate. The profiler detects when behavior is defensive, when it's authentic, and when it's rehearsed. This is evident in response times, in the relationship between emotion and content, and in the energy behind the discourse. Genuine emotional responses are immediate and disordered. Calculated responses are slow, structured, and devoid of real emotion. Someone who responds as if presenting a script is likely hiding their truth. Another key resource is comparative observation. The profiler contrasts what a person does with what they say, what they project with what they hide. They don't believe everything they hear, but they don't let themselves be guided solely by what they see. They seek coherence between what is said, what is done, and what is felt. This triple verification, verbal, physical, and emotional, allows for the construction of a robust profile that doesn't depend on a single source of information. Because human truth is multidimensional. Only those who integrate these dimensions can see with depth. The ability to analyze coldly also involves mastering your own internal world. You can't think clearly if you're emotionally involved. The profiler trains to separate what they observe from what they feel. This doesn't mean being insensitive, but rather being clear. When your emotions get in the way of analysis, you project, interpret with bias, and take mental shortcuts. But when you're calm, you can see beyond the surface. You can distinguish between what's relevant and what's noise. And that's what differentiates the intuitive observer from the professional. The ability to filter, select, and synthesize. Ultimately, every profiler knows that the most important thing isn't the isolated data, but the pattern. It doesn't matter if someone crossed their arms or looked away once. It matters if they always do it in certain situations. It matters the context, the timing, the frequency, the evolution. Building a profile is like putting together a puzzle. Each piece seems irrelevant on its own, but when you put them together with patience and logic, a clear picture emerges. And when that picture is formed, you no longer need to guess. You know who's in front of you. not by intuition, but by analysis. Not by reaction, but by sustained observation. Thinking like a professional profiler isn't something you achieve overnight. It requires practice, discipline, humility, and a lot of presence. But once you develop this way of seeing, you can't stop applying it. You begin to notice patterns in everything. In language, in emotions, in people's decisions. And each new person you meet becomes an open book, not because they tell you everything, but because you know how to read what's left unsaid. That's the art of cold analysis. Seeing beyond the obvious, connecting the dots precisely, understanding the other person so clearly that you no longer need to guess. Because the truth, when observed without emotion and with structure, always reveals itself. You just have to know how to look. Chapter 11. Cognitive Load and Truthfulness. How the Mind Betrays the Liar. The concept of cognitive load is one of the most powerful tools for those who want to detect inconsistencies, deceptions, and contradictions in real time. Understanding how the mind works under mental pressure allows us to more precisely observe the moments when someone begins to stumble over their own words or realize that what they say doesn't match what actually happened. The human mind has a limit to the amount of information it can process simultaneously, and when that limit is exceeded, errors appear. This is where well-structured lies fall apart, because the liar must no longer just remember what they wanted to say, but also how they said it before, how they are saying it now, what they should avoid, what they should emphasize, and how they should sound convincing, all at the same time. When a person tells the truth, the mental effort they expend is minimal. They are recounting a real memory, a previously lived experience, an authentic emotion. The information flows because it is connected to their emotional memory. But when they lie, everything changes. They must now create a narrative from scratch, ensure it sounds logical, avoid inconsistencies, manage their body language and emotions, and at the same time, analyze the other person's reaction. This mental overload, when deliberately increased through strategic questions, leads to gaps in the story, hesitations, longer pauses, unnatural responses, or even unintentional contradictions. One of the most effective ways to increase cognitive load without confrontation is to ask someone to tell a story in reverse order. If someone is narrating an event to you in chronological order, you can calmly ask, "Could you tell me the same thing, but from the end to the beginning?" This simple request forces the brain to reconstruct the narrative without the usual rhythm of recall, which puts the liar in an awkward position. If the story was fabricated, there's no real sequence in their memory they can retrieve. They have to reconstruct it logically, piece by piece, under pressure, and that's where inconsistencies usually appear. A truth-teller, on the other hand, may hesitate for a moment, but manages to do so without deep inconsistencies because their mind accesses the original memory. Another resource is to introduce subtle details into the conversation and then return to them later to see if they hold up. For example, if someone says they were with a certain person in a certain place, you can, minutes later, return to the subject and ask, "So, when you were at the cafe, you said it was before or after it rained?" The goal isn't to directly uncover the lie, but to observe how the other person sustains the details under the weight of time and accumulated mental effort. If the story changes, if the order of events is illogically altered, if the person needs to think too hard to answer something they should remember clearly, the cognitive load is taking its toll and the cracks in the lie are showing. Body language also changes when cognitive load increases. The person may begin to pause more, touch their face or neck, move their eyes differently, or simply adopt a more tense posture. This isn't necessarily due to guilt, but rather due to the amount of effort required to sustain the lie. Mental overload has observable physical effects. The liar tires more quickly, loses naturalness, and what initially seemed like fluid speech becomes increasingly mechanical and forced. It's important to observe not only what they say, but also how their delivery changes as the conversation progresses and becomes more demanding. You can also use unexpected or out-of-context questions to destabilize the narrative. For example, if someone is telling you a story, you can interrupt with a seemingly irrelevant question, "What time was it when that happened?" Or, "Do you remember what you were wearing that day?" Although they may seem harmless, these questions introduce a new level of mental processing. If the story was fabricated, the liar has to add a detail they hadn't considered before, and this involves improvising on the spot. In this effort, they often contradict themselves or respond with uncertainty. A truth-teller, on the other hand, may recall details naturally or even admit they don't remember, which, paradoxically, can be a sign of truthfulness. Another method of applying cognitive load is to ask the other person to perform an additional task while they respond. This can be done subtly. For example, while they're speaking, you can place something in their hands, ask them to look at something, or complete a small secondary verbal task. This technique, used in professional profiling contexts, allows us to observe how someone behaves when they have to divide their attention. When a person is telling the truth, they can maintain the thread of the story while performing another action. But if they're lying, this multitasking becomes a trigger for errors. They begin to repeat phrases, stutter, lose the thread, or respond illogically. It's vital to understand that cognitive load isn't a punishment, but rather a strategy for revealing what isn't solid. The truth can withstand pressure because it's rooted in real experience. Lies, on the other hand, are fragile constructs that need to be constantly sustained. The goal in applying these techniques isn't to destroy the other person, but rather to clearly reveal what's hidden, without the need to shout, accuse, or invade. True people readers use pressure ethically, sparingly, and with the goal of achieving clarity, not control. Furthermore, it's crucial to observe the contrast between the interlocutor's initial behavior and how it evolves during the conversation. Often, when someone begins a lie, they do so with confidence. They have a rehearsed script, a prepared story. But as more information is demanded, as the questions, details, and repetitions increase, they begin to show signs of stress. This progressive deterioration of the narrative is one of the most accurate indicators of deception under cognitive load. A liar becomes exhausted. A truth-teller may tire, but they don't contradict themselves. Finally, it's important to remember that these techniques are only effective when combined with a balanced emotional presence. If the observer is upset, anxious, or overly involved, they may interpret any signal as a sign of lying, which leads to serious errors. The observing mind must be calm. The ego must be silent. Only in this way is it possible to capture the true signals that cognitive load reveals. Because the problem isn't that the mind lies, but that by doing so, it betrays itself. And the trained observer doesn't need to catch. They only need to see how, under pressure, truth and lies separate. Chapter 12. Social Adaptability. Reading Groups, Hierarchies, and Hidden Dynamics. Understanding a person in a one-on-one conversation is a valuable skill, but reading someone within a group reveals a higher level of mastery. Social dynamics are full of invisible codes, unstated hierarchies, habitually assumed roles, and underlying relationships that determine how individuals behave. Often, what a person says in a group doesn't represent their true opinion, but rather their way of adapting to social pressure or fulfilling an unconsciously assigned role. It is in this context that observation becomes more complex and, at the same time, more revealing. Those who manage to interpret these hidden patterns not only understand people but also anticipate their reactions, influences, and decisions before they are expressed. Social adaptability begins with understanding the group as a living system. In any meeting, team, or social interaction, there are forces operating simultaneously. Leadership, influence, rivalry, submission, competition, validation. These elements are not always explicit, but they manifest themselves in the way people position themselves, look, listen, or interrupt. For example, the true leader of a group is not always the one with the highest title, but rather the one who commands attention when they speak, who influences the body language of others, who changes the atmosphere of the room with their presence. Detecting this figure is essential to understanding how the group operates. One of the clearest indicators of undeclared power is eye contact. Observe who is looking at whom when someone is speaking. In general, people tend to look at the individual they consider most influential to validate their reaction. If someone at a table is speaking, but everyone else is looking at someone else to see how they react, that other person is the one who carries the true emotional weight in the group. It's also important to note who is interrupted and who isn't, who feels free to speak when they want to, and who waits for the right moment. These dynamics reveal subtle hierarchies and real social power, beyond titles or labels. Another key is to observe the layout of the space. Where each person sits, how they are grouped, who is close to whom and who distances themselves, are all signs of emotional connection or distance. In a meeting, those who sit together often share unspoken alliances or feel mutually comfortable. Those who isolate themselves or maintain a marked distance from others may disagree, feel threatened, or simply not be part of the core of influence. Space communicates. And those who master social reading know that positions are not accidental. They reflect the psychological structure of the group. Body language also changes depending on who leads the group. People tend to unconsciously imitate the gestures, postures, and expressions of the informal leader. This imitation, known as the chameleon effect, stems from the human need for belonging and acceptance. Anyone who detects these micro-mirrors can quickly identify the group's reference point. Furthermore, if you notice that when someone enters or leaves the room, the entire group readjusts, changes tone, topic, or attitude, you have a silent authority figure before you. This isn't always a leader. It can be the emotional center of the group. Voices also change in social settings. People adapt their tone, volume, and pace to suit their audience. Some become softer when they're around powerful figures. Others become more aggressive if they perceive they can dominate. Hearing how one's voice changes in the presence of certain individuals is a clue to how the relationship is perceived. Likewise, some people only feel free to express their opinion when someone else has paved the way. These emotional followers reveal social dependence, and their behavior is conditioned by the group's opinion leaders. Within any social dynamic, there are unspoken roles: the leader, the mediator, the opponent, the distracted, the loyalist, the silent critic. These roles are not verbally assigned, but emerge again and again in different situations. The skilled observer quickly identifies these roles and understands how they interact. For example, the mediator tends to smooth over conflicts, the opponent tends to challenge any new idea, the loyalist constantly validates the leader, and the distracted avoids confrontation and takes refuge in neutrality. Understanding these patterns allows you not only to read the group, but also to intervene strategically, whether to influence, resolve tensions, or simply position yourself intelligently. It's also important to observe micro-alliances. These are perceived in the exchange of knowing glances, subtle support, shared silences, or laughter that only a few understand. An emotional alliance between two or more group members can change the entire dynamic. For example, if two influential figures in the group are aligned, the others are likely to adjust their behavior to avoid disrupting that harmony. On the other hand, if they are tense, divisions arise that affect overall communication. The social reader doesn't just observe individuals, but also bonds. Because relationships define behaviors as much as personalities. Conflict is also a great revealer of hidden hierarchies. When there is a disagreement, who stands firm, who gives in, who intervenes, and who remains silent are essential elements for understanding how emotional power is distributed within the group. Some act as stabilizers. Their mere intervention calms the tension. Others, however, amplify the chaos. Identifying these hidden functions allows us to better understand why certain dynamics recur and how to anticipate them. Conflict is not a flaw in social dynamics. It is an opportunity to see what is normally hidden. We must also mention the use of humor, irony, or sarcasm in social contexts. These forms of expression often hide tensions, disagreements, or hidden alliances. Those who use humor strategically can deflect an uncomfortable topic, weaken a rival, or strengthen their position without appearing aggressive. Shared laughter unites, but it can also exclude. Observing who laughs, when, and with whom allows us to map the emotional flow of the group and detect who influences the atmosphere without the need to overtly dominate. Finally, social adaptation doesn't mean imitating or losing authenticity, but rather having the ability to accurately read the environment and move with relational intelligence. The observer who understands group dynamics isn't the one who talks the most, but the one who detects the silent movements that others ignore. And with that understanding, they can make better decisions. When to intervene, when to remain silent, who to listen to, who to support. Because in groups, it's not the strongest who survives, but the most aware. And awareness is born from silent observation, from analysis without judgment, from sensitivity without protagonism. Knowing how to read groups, hierarchies, and hidden dynamics gives you an advantage few possess. The ability to anticipate behaviors, foresee conflicts, effortlessly gain influence, and move with ease in any social setting. You no longer react. You interpret. You no longer compete. You flow. Because you see what others don't. The silent code that moves people when they're surrounded by others. And once you understand that code, you can navigate any group with confidence, adapt without betraying yourself, and lead without needing to impose. That's social mastery. That's advanced reading. Chapter 13. Applied Emotional Intelligence. Empathy without losing mental clarity. True emotional intelligence isn't simply about being empathetic or understanding the feelings of others. It goes much further. It's a practical, mature, and powerful skill that allows you to connect deeply with people without losing your center, without getting confused by other people's emotions, without compromising your mental clarity or judgment. It's the ability to enter another person's emotional world while maintaining your own, to feel without getting trapped, to understand without being manipulated. Because empathy without mental structure becomes poorly managed vulnerability. And objectivity without emotional connection becomes ineffective coldness. The middle ground between the two extremes is where true applied emotional strength lies. Genuinely connecting involves total presence. It means listening with all your senses, capturing the emotional nuances behind words, understanding not only what the other person is saying, but why they're saying it, where they're coming from, and what they emotionally need at that moment. It means looking at someone and seeing beyond the mask, detecting the fatigue behind the smile, the pride behind the silence, the fear behind the anger. But to keep that connection from overwhelming you, you need a solid foundation of self-awareness. You need to know how you're feeling emotionally, what triggers you, what makes you uncomfortable, what parts of you are vulnerable to certain emotions from others. Because those who don't know themselves end up adopting the other person's emotions as their own, and that's where clarity is lost. One of the main keys to applied emotional intelligence is knowing how to distinguish between understanding someone and justifying them. You can understand when a person acts out of pain, fear, or insecurity, but that doesn't mean accepting or allowing destructive behavior. Empathy isn't permissiveness. It's the ability to read others while still protecting your own inner space. You can accompany someone's emotional process without burdening them. You can sense what the other person is feeling, but consciously choose how to respond. That is true strength, not reacting out of contagion, but responding from your inner balance. Strategic emotional management also involves knowing when to speak and when to remain silent. There are times when the best thing you can do for someone is simply to be present, without giving your opinion, without interrupting, without trying to fix anything. Simply hold the emotional space with your presence. But there are also times when it's necessary to set clear boundaries, even if the other person doesn't understand. Emotional intelligence allows you to do this without aggression, without blame, without needing to defend yourself. When you know who you are, you don't need to justify yourself. You can say no firmly and with love. You can withdraw from a conversation without resentment. You can stake your claim without breaking the connection. Another essential component is the ability to regulate your own emotions in real time. This doesn't mean repressing what you feel, but rather knowing how to manage it without it controlling you. For example, if someone speaks to you aggressively or sarcastically, it's normal to feel anger or discomfort. But if you act on that emotion without filtering it, you play into the other person's hands. On the other hand, if you acknowledge what you feel and decide not to react automatically, you regain control. You observe, you breathe, you choose. That conscious pause between stimulus and response is what defines emotionally intelligent people. They don't get carried away by impulses, but rather observe them and decide freely. It's also essential to understand that emotional connection doesn't always mean agreeing. You can validate someone's pain without agreeing with their point of view. You can show compassion without having to give in. You can accept that another person sees the world differently without feeling compelled to convince them. This requires a solid internal structure, a clear identity, a sense of self that doesn't crumble in the face of difference. And at the same time, a genuine sensitivity so as not to disconnect emotionally in the name of objectivity. Because disconnecting is also a way of avoiding feeling. And avoiding feeling is losing human depth. In contexts of emotional manipulation, emotional intelligence becomes a powerful shield. Many people, consciously or unconsciously, try to generate guilt, obligation, or fear to control others. They use drama, victimization, or passive-aggressive silence as power strategies. If you're not emotionally grounded, you can fall into these traps and act out of guilt or confusion. But if you develop the ability to read these dynamics without getting involved, you can stand your ground without losing empathy. You can say, "I understand how you feel, but that doesn't change my decision." That phrase, said calmly, diffuses many forms of manipulation without the need for confrontation. Applied emotional intelligence also allows you to lead without imposing. An emotionally aware person doesn't dominate others, but rather has a profound influence. Because their presence generates security. Because their listening is so real that it invites openness. Because their energy is so stable that others regulate their emotions when they are around. This type of silent leadership is more powerful than 1,000 speeches. It's not based on charisma or external authority, but on internal coherence. And that coherence is only achieved when you know who you are, what you feel, what boundaries you need, and how you want to relate to the world. To develop this skill, it's necessary to practice constant self-analysis. Ask yourself in every interaction, am I feeling my own way or the other person's? Am I reacting or choosing? Am I understanding from the heart or giving in out of fear? Am I losing clarity by trying to please? These questions bring you back to center. Because emotional balance isn't a permanent state, but rather an ongoing practice. Every conversation is an opportunity to fine-tune that awareness, to test your ability to stay connected and clear at the same time. At its core, applied emotional intelligence is a way of life. It's consciously deciding how you want to interact with your own and others' emotional world. It's refusing to be a victim of your reactions and also refusing to be cold or insensitive. It's accepting that sensitivity isn't weakness and that objectivity isn't coldness. It's understanding that you can be deep and firm, empathetic and clear, open and structured. And when you achieve that balance, everything changes. Because now you see people with more compassion and more precision. Because you no longer need to overprotect yourself or give yourself away completely. Because you can look anyone in the eye and still be yourself. No defenses. No masks. Just presence. And that presence, silent but powerful, becomes your greatest influence. Chapter 14. Interpreting High-Intensity Signals. Crisis, Pressure, and Difficult Conversations. Reading people in normal contexts already requires attention, sensitivity, and training. But when emotions intensify, when someone is under pressure, stress, or in the middle of a difficult conversation, the signals change, become distorted, and often intensify. It is in these moments that rational filters weaken and the authentic, the unconscious, and the visceral emerge more strongly. The key is knowing how to distinguish a momentary emotional response from a profound manifestation of character. Because under pressure, some reveal their essence, while others only display their rawest defense mechanisms. Understanding this difference is what separates the intuitive observer from the trained observer. When a person finds themselves in a highly emotional situation, their body language becomes more evident, but also more complex. Some signals may appear aggressive, when in fact they are actually fearful. Others may appear controlled, when in fact they are suppressive mechanisms. Strong emotions generate inconsistencies between what is said and what is physically expressed. For example, someone may say, "I'm fine," but their hands are shaking, their jaw is tense, and their feet are pointed toward the exit. These small details, invisible to many, scream the truth to the trained eye. And that's where deep reading comes into play. Not only seeing what is being shown, but interpreting what they are trying to hide under the pressure. One of the most common mistakes when interpreting signals under stress is assuming that every exaggerated reaction is a lie or manipulation. This isn't always the case. Stress amplifies everything: gestures, words, emotions. Some people cry in frustration, others shut down, others become aggressive, and many simply collapse into silence. The emotional reader must learn to see through the form to grasp the intention. Because what's important isn't just what someone does, but where they do it from. A defensive response can be a sign of trauma, not deception. A disproportionate reaction can be the result of an internal story triggered by that moment. And only those who observe without judgment can access that level of understanding. During a difficult conversation, the rhythm of emotional responses changes. The body begins to react faster than the mind. The pauses between questions and answers become significantly shorter or longer. The tone of voice may become uneven, broken, or too high-pitched. The eyes avoid eye contact or, on the contrary, remain fixed as a form of defense. These changes are like an emotional code that, if interpreted correctly, reveals the person's true state. And it's not necessary to talk about emotions to detect them. Just observe how the body changes when a sensitive topic is touched upon, how the posture contracts or stiffens, how the speech loses fluidity. The body reacts before the mind can control the narrative. In crisis contexts, such as an intense argument, a loss, a profound conflict, or a difficult situation, many of the social masks we normally use are deactivated. People become more authentic, but also more fragile. This applies not only to sadness or fear, but also to pride, the need to control, and the impulse to dominate. Some use anger as emotional armor. Others use forced calm as a shield of containment. And still others take refuge in sarcasm or evasion. All of these are adaptive responses that reveal much more than meets the eye. Because intensity reveals a person's true emotional makeup. What triggers them, what hurts them, what threatens them, and what they need. An effective technique for reading signals in these moments is to lower your own emotional intensity. When you remain calm in front of a person in crisis, your serenity creates a contrast. That contrast makes the other person's signals stand out even more. Furthermore, your steady presence acts as an emotional anchor, which often causes the other person to reveal themselves more clearly. Not because they calm down, but because they stop wasting energy defending themselves against your reaction. This is where you can observe precisely when the other person doesn't feel attacked, but also doesn't feel overly validated. Your emotional neutrality becomes a mirror in which the other person is clearly reflected. It's also crucial to pay attention to changes in pattern. A person who is normally open and communicative and suddenly becomes evasive or monosyllabic is sending signals of emotional tension. Similarly, someone who usually avoids eye contact and suddenly maintains an unblinking gaze is showing a change that requires interpretation. These changes aren't necessarily signs of deception, but rather of emotional charge. And that charge can come from fear, guilt, frustration, or simply exhaustion. Reading these changes allows you to adjust your communication style so as not to unnecessarily escalate tension. In intense conversations, pauses speak louder than words. A long silence before responding doesn't always indicate a lie. It's often an attempt to regulate one's feelings so one can continue speaking. A prolonged sigh, a held breath, a gesture that hadn't appeared before, all of these are fragments of valuable emotional information. Learning to read them without interrupting is an art. Because the other person often needs that space to access what they truly want to express. And if you rush them, if you fill them with questions or confront them, they'll shut down. Reading isn't always about intervening. Sometimes it's simply about holding the space and letting what's unsaid reveal itself. Another essential point is to understand that, under pressure, people tend to revert to their most primitive emotional patterns. That is, those they developed in childhood to deal with difficult situations. Some avoid, others attack, and others desperately seek approval. These patterns aren't rational. They're automatic. And if you can detect them, you can anticipate the type of reaction a person will have when you push them emotionally. This anticipation isn't used to manipulate, but to contain, to nurture communication, to know how far you can go without breaking the connection. That's why it's so important to develop emotional observation based on firm compassion. It's not about looking down on others, or feeling pity, or minimizing what the other person is experiencing. It's about looking from a place of understanding and clarity. It's about knowing that in moments of greatest emotional intensity, people aren't at their best. But it's also about knowing that there, in the excess, in the crisis, in the overreaction, there are truths that wouldn't otherwise appear. And if you are lucidly present, you can see them, integrate them, and use them to better understand, to better communicate, and ultimately, to connect from a much deeper and more real place. Reading in moments of high emotional intensity is, then, a form of advanced vision. It's a reading that isn't based only on what's visible, but on what lies beneath. It's a listening that doesn't wait for answers, but for signs. And it's a presence that doesn't need to intervene to influence. It just needs to be there. Because when you're truly present with someone who's crumbling or defending themselves, they also feel seen differently. And sometimes, just because of that, they let their guard down. Just because of that, they show themselves as they really are. And in that honesty, even if it's uncomfortable, lies the purest emotional truth. The one that needs no words. The one that can only be observed when everything else falls away. Chapter 15. Final Integration. Becoming a keen and accurate people reader. Becoming a sharp and accurate people reader isn't the result of memorizing techniques or applying mechanical formulas. It's a deep, gradual, and conscious integration of everything you've learned, put into daily practice with intention, presence, and ethics. Emotional, behavioral, and contextual reading isn't about having power over others, but rather about better understanding the human world in order to relate from a more real, more strategic, and also more empathetic place. The skills you've developed so far, from capturing body language, microexpressions, and social dynamics, to managing cognitive load and applying emotional intelligence in complex situations, now form a network of tools that only become accurate if they align with your awareness and character. Reading people is, in the end, an invisible art. You don't flaunt it. You don't use it as a way to demonstrate intelligence or superiority. You use it as a way to serve, to protect yourself, to choose your relationships better, to anticipate unnecessary conflicts, to conserve your energy, and also to influence with integrity. When you observe someone and detect inconsistencies, fears, manipulations, or signs of hidden truth, true mastery isn't in pointing it out or confronting them. It's in knowing what to do with that information. Because not everything you can see should be revealed, not every truth should be spoken, and not every emotion should be exposed. Learning to remain silent when necessary, to act without words, to intervene with surgical precision at the right moment, that is what makes an observer a profound reader. Daily practice is essential. It's not about turning every interaction into an analysis, but rather about keeping your attention active. Observe how people react in simple situations. How they enter a room, how they respond to an interruption, how their expression changes when a name is mentioned, how they play with their hands while waiting, how they pause before answering a difficult question. These small details aren't just curiosities, they're gateways to the invisible. And the more you train yourself to notice the subtle effortlessly, the more accurate you become. Your mind no longer needs to consciously process every signal. Your intuition begins to operate from a solid foundation of knowledge and experience. One of the most common mistakes among those beginning to develop these skills is falling into paranoia or overinterpretation. Not every gesture hides something. Not every pause indicates a lie. Not every change of posture is an internal conflict. You have to know when to observe and when to simply be present without analyzing. Overreading can become a mental trap, taking you away from the real moment and creating unnecessary judgments. Therefore, true integration is not only technical, it's also emotional. It requires self-confidence, patience, humility, and a great deal of self-awareness. Because what you see in others is also a reflection of what you haven't yet fully seen in yourself. And that's where ethics comes in. Why do you want to understand people at that level? What will you do with what you see? How will you use this knowledge? The line between influencing and invading, between guiding and controlling, between reading to connect or reading to manipulate, is subtle. And no one can draw it for you, only your conscience will. Accurately reading people must be in the service of growth, of deep human connection, of responsible leadership, of clear communication, of harm prevention. Never as a power play, never as a way to humiliate or expose others. When used ethically, this knowledge makes you someone trustworthy, a presence others respect because they feel seen without being judged. The advanced people reader doesn't obsess over what others feel, but they aren't indifferent either. They know when to engage, when to withdraw, when to remain silent, and when to ask the question that changes everything. Because what they have developed is not just an analytical capacity, but a cultivated sensitivity. A sensitivity that doesn't weaken them, but rather strengthens them. Because they understand that seeing the emotional truth of others is not a supernatural gift, but a responsibility. And when that responsibility is honored, their communication improves, their relationships become more authentic, their leadership stronger, and their decision-making more accurate. Over time, this way of seeing the world becomes part of you. You no longer need to struggle to read others. You do it without realizing it. Your presence becomes more refined. Your listening becomes deeper. Your decisions become more intuitive and precise. You can walk into a room and sense the atmosphere. You can talk to someone and detect their insecurity disguised as arrogance. You can navigate a difficult process without absorbing the other person's emotional chaos. And you can maintain your clarity in the midst of any dynamic. You don't learn that in a single day. It's built with practice, with mistakes, with constant adjustments. But above all, it's built from the decision to use this ability to uplift, not to control. And if you ever feel like you've misinterpreted, misread a signal, or reacted with bias, that's okay. The accurate people reader isn't infallible. They're aware. They know how to correct themselves, apologize if necessary, and adjust their perception. Because perfection isn't the goal. Consistency is. Consistency between what you see, what you feel, what you decide, and what you communicate. That consistency gives you peace. It allows you to navigate the social world without masks, without paranoia, without naivete, but with depth and dignity. Thus ends this journey, not as a final point, but as an opening. Because now you know that every human interaction is a universe. That every gesture, word, silence, and glance is valuable information if you know how to read it. That you too are being read, that we are all in a constant mirror. And that true mastery lies not in understanding everything, but in knowing when to see, when to let go, when to act, and when to simply be. This silent wisdom is what transforms the observer into a guide, the communicator into a bridge, the reader of people into a true architect of deep and conscious human relationships. So, if this audiobook inspired you and you're ready to continue delving deeper into your personal growth and inner transformation, I invite you to discover another eye-opening audiobook that will change the way you see the world, your decisions, and your potential. Click here, and I'll see you there.